Okay, it turns out I had recorded the first part that I'm recording right now of the problem of political authority. And then I had finished the last few chapters on the camping trip this weekend. And then when I went to put them all together, it turns out somewhere along the line I deleted my previous recordings. So I've got to do them again and try to figure out where I left off so they all mash together. But if it seems like they were recorded out of order, somehow inevitably you pick up on that, well, they were. So this chapter is called Consequentialism and Fairness. So he does consequentialist arguments for political obligation. So far, this has been my least favorite chapter, I guess because it's the one that doesn't come down quite so hard that there's absolutely no such thing as political obligation. He actually does end up potentially giving an out for a tiny, tiny state. But of course, that shouldn't surprise us because really, if there's going to be any kind of state, that's the only one there can be an argument for. And frankly, if there were one, I would probably find another hobby. So, the structure of consequentialist arguments for political obligation. Because the simplest arguments for political authority are consequentialist ones. By consequentialist arguments for authority, I mean arguments that ascribe moral weight to the goodness or badness of an action's consequences and that appeal directly to that factor and attempting to derive political obligation and legitimacy. I focus in this section on the arguments for political obligation. These arguments proceed in two stages. First, one argues that there are great values that are secured by government and could not be secured by government. Second, one argues that this fact imposes on individuals an obligation to obey the state on the grounds that we have a duty to promote the values addressed in the first state of the argument, and B, obedience to the law is the best way of promoting those values, and disobedience is a best way of undermining them. So, the benefits of government. The first major good ascribed to government is that of protection from crimes committed by individuals against other individuals, especially violent crimes and property crimes. The second major benefit ascribed to government is the provision of a detailed, precise, and public set of rules of social conduct that apply uniformly across society. The third benefit provided by government is that of military defense. And then he goes on, though, to let us know that in part 2, he challenges the widespread assumption that government is needed to provide these benefits. But for this chapter, he'll grant, for the sake of argument, that it is. But he says, even granting this for the sake of argument, one cannot derive political authority as commonly understood. He does derive a certain kind of authority, but he doesn't concede it is political authority. Okay, I'm actually in the camper. As you can see, let me try to get centered here, not censored. I can do that without trying. I got my pudding cup up there, you can see. A couple dogs, but I figured while we was waiting on dinner that, I'm sorry if you can hear the chatter in the background. The stove is right on the other side of here, but that I would figure I would do the last part of the problem of political authority while I had the time, because, you know, life is crazy busy. So the next section, the subtitle is The Problem of Individual Redundancy. So, he says, there are some laws you should obey for independent moral reasons. And I think we all agree with that, not because of the law, but because it's morally correct. For instance, you should not rob other people. This is not because your doing so might destroy the government. It's because robbing other people would be an injustice to the specific people robbed. This is not an example of a political obligation. It is simply an example of a general moral obligation to other people. Many other laws similarly correspond to independently compelling moral principles. To defend political obligation, one must argue that there is a content-independent obligation to obey the law because it is the law. That is, one must obey the law, even the laws that do not correspond to independent moral principles. So then he starts getting into forms of consequentialism, and the first one is rule, R-U-L-E, consequentialism. He said rule consequentialism holds that rather than choosing that a particular action that will produce the best consequence given the present circumstances, one should act according to general rules, and one should choose the rules that, if generally adopted, would have the best consequence. And then I'm not going to get into this a great deal. Again, a lot of this is to just skim the thoughts that are in this book. I would highly encourage you to, read it yourself. It is very good. But he says that rule consequentialism is only defensible in certain moral circumstances and certain limited circumstances, but it's defensible only if it doesn't support a general defense of political obligation. So for instance, let me actually give the example because it's really good. He says in some cases this idea is plausible. Take the case of a newly planted lawn on a university campus. Students and professors are tempted to take shortcuts across the lawn while walking from building to building. One person cutting across the lawn will have no noticeable effect. But if everybody does it, the pristine lawn will be marred by an ugly footpath running through the middle of it. Assume that the aesthetic disvalue of the path outweighs the total benefit it provides in terms of time saved. In this situation, many find it plausible that one ought to not walk across the lawn. This appears to be an illustration of the what if everyone did that principle. The principle that one ought not to do that which would be bad if generally practiced. And what's unsaid there, even if it's okay if one person did it. But in other cases, the principle seems absurd. Suppose I decide to become a professional philosopher. This seems permissible. But what if everybody did this? Everyone would philosophize all day and we would all starve. Presumably, this does not show that it's morally wrong to be a professional philosopher. We will not, in fact, starve because the farmers are not all going to become philosophers merely because I decide to become one. The dog is making some interesting noises. So in this case, what would happen if everyone did it seems irrelevant. One might try to save rule consequentialism from this objection by taking a more nuanced view of the rule I'm acting on. Perhaps when I decide to become a philosopher, I'm not acting on the rule, be a philosopher, but on some more complex rule, such as be a philosopher provided there are not already far too many philosophers, or choose the profession best suited to you, provided that there are enough people in other professions that you are doing so it does not have serious negative consequences. If everyone acted on either of those rules, then we would not all starve. But just as I may claim to be following the rule, be a philosopher, provided there are not too many philosophers, or provided that there will be no serious consequences, individuals who choose to break the law could often claim to be following some rules such as break the law when what the law commands is not independently morally required, provided there are not too many people breaking the law, or provided that your doing so will not have serious negative consequences. The proviso tacked onto the end of this rule is perfectly parallel to the proviso tacked onto the be a philosopher rule. So whatever rationale allows us to include the latter proviso will almost certainly license inclusion of the former. So that's when he ended with the sentence I did read. It appears then that rule consequentialism itself is defensible only if it does not support a general defense of political obligation. So I'm just looking. This might have to be several recordings. Okay, so because I like to keep these at 10-minute chunks. Fairness. This is the fairness theory of political obligation. Another account holds that one must obey the law because to disobey is unfair to other members of one's society who generally obey. I shall refer to this sort of obligation as fair play. The argument is not a consequentialist one. The claim is not that one's disobedience will cause harmful consequences. Nevertheless, it is easy to move from consequentialist theories to the fairness theory. And then he goes on again about using that philosopher example. He says, there's nothing unfair about my becoming a philosopher, despite the fact that it would be bad if everyone did so. In being a philosopher, I do not, for example, increase the burdens on members of other professions. On the contrary, those other professions might prefer less competition. So he says, advocates of the fair play account argue that to disobey the law is to treat other members of one's society unfairly. Government produces significant benefits. Other members of one's society, by paying taxes and obeying laws, have undertaken the costs required to provide these benefits. All of us share in at least some of the benefits of government, and most receive a fair share of those benefits. Each of those, so he's arguing their argument. Each of us can casually contribute to providing the benefits by paying taxes and obeying the laws. The cost is significant, but is typically comparable to the cost borne by others and is reasonable in view of the benefits. Therefore, it would be unfair not to do our part in supporting government by paying taxes and generally obeying the laws. Now, that is their argument. But he then breaks this down to obedience as the cost of political goods. He says, in the case of some laws, it's very plausible that obedience contributes to the provision of these benefits and thus counts as sharing in the cost of their provision. Consider the laws against murder and theft. By obeying these laws, I directly contribute to the good of society for other members of my society. But this does not obviously exemplify political obligation because I have an obligation independent of the law to respect the rights of others. It's not clear that the existence against murder increases my moral obligation not to commit murder, nor that it increases the unfairness involved in murdering somebody. Okay, so there is a big chunk here that we're going to continue with the fair play account in my next chunk of recording because it gets a bit tiring. So I thought I only really had one section left to record, but it's going to be at least one more. All right, I'll probably do that while I'm out here camping, but it might be tomorrow or later tonight. Okay, I'm back recording in the trailer, and maybe this will be the last section. So remember, we were dealing with the fair play account for political authority. And he said, obedience to the law, according to the advocates of the fair play account, is analogous to helping bail water out of a lifeboat. But in view of the aforementioned laws, a closer analogy would be as follows. So he's giving, I guess, what he would think would be a better analogy. The lifeboat is taking on water. The passengers gather and discuss what to do about the problem. A majority, not including you, want Bob to devise a solution. Bob thinks for a minute, then announces the following plan. All passengers shall start bailing water out of the boat. They shall pray to Poseidon to ask for his mercy. They shall flagellate themselves with belts to prove their seriousness, and they shall each pay $50 to Sally, who helped Bob get elected. You know that item 1 is useful, 2 is useless, and 3 and 4 are harmful to most passengers. Nonetheless, most passengers participate in all 4 parts of Bob's plan. If you refuse to pray, self-flagellate, or pay Sally, do you thereby act wrongly? Do you treat the other passengers unfairly? Recall that political obligations are supposed to be content independent. That is, one must follow the law regardless of its content within some broad constraints and regardless of whether the law is correct. The above discussion suggests this is not the case. One must examine the content of a particular law to determine whether the behavior it enjoins generally contributes to the provision of political goods before one can say whether one has any fairness-based reason to follow the law. Some would argue that even if a given law is not needed to carry out the government's central functions, obedience to that law is still part of the cost of providing essential government services, because disobedience risks bringing down the government, I wish, and all social order. We have criticized this sort of claim. But if it were true, it would do as much to undermine content-independent political legitimacy as it would to support content-independent political obligation. Presumably, if individuals are obligated to help social order, the state is similarly obligated. If disobedience to any law risks causing a collapse of social order, then the state, in making laws that are not necessary to maintain social order and that are likely to be widely disobeyed, is itself threatening social order far more than any single individual who disobeys one of these laws. That is super powerful observation. And I'm kind of ashamed of myself that I didn't think of it. That we are so ingrained to exempt the state from each of these things. We go, yeah, but if an individual did this, yeah, but what about the state? Very good. Furthermore, asking the state to renounce its desire to make such unnecessary laws is more reasonable and less onerous than asking an individual to renounce his personal liberties. Ooh, that's good too. Therefore, if one holds that the individual nevertheless must obey such laws when they are made, it is much clearer that the state must not make any such laws, and thus one cannot simultaneously defend political obligation and political legitimacy on this view. A second problem for the fair play account concerns those who fail to endorse the state activities. This includes some individuals who feel they do not need the state. For example, hermits living out in the wilderness, or indigenous peoples who would prefer that European colonists never arrived on their continent. It also includes those who are morally or ideologically opposed to government in general, anarchists. It includes people who, while supporting the general idea of government, believe that the proper sort of government is radically different than the government they have. And it includes people who oppose specific government programs, but are nevertheless forced to contribute to them. For instance, pacifists may not want the alleged good of a military force, yet they must pay for it as everyone else. Yet we have seen that it's difficult to account for an obligation to assist in useless or harmful projects. Here we see it's also difficult to account for an obligation to assist in projects to which one is sincerely opposed, whether or not one's opposition is well-founded. In the political sense, there are a number of individuals who oppose various government programs. These are not people who seek to free ride on others' efforts. They are not simply wishing for others to bear the program's costs. There are even some who reasonably regard the institution of government itself as unjust. If one reasonably regards a project as unjust or immoral, one is hardly free-riding, taking advantage of others, or treating others unfairly and refusing to support that project. Again, no basis for content-independent political obligation is to be found. So, into the next larger subsection called the problem of legitimacy, and subsection a consequentialist account of legitimacy. And he says, and here's where I disagree, he gives a lifeboat scenario basically and says, well, this suggests a principle that it is permissible to coerce a person or violate a person's property rights, provided that doing so is necessary to prevent something much worse from happening. Well, I don't think lifeboat situations are necessarily good to derive general principles from. And I don't think it's permissible to coerce a person ever. There can be circumstances where I'm not going to say it's permissible to violate property rights, but in judging whether or not property rights were violated, I do think intent comes into play. And, you know, I don't believe libertarianism is a philosophy about living in isolation. So in a society judging whether or not your reaction or what you are going to demand for the violation of property rights, it's going to be subject to some sort of peer pressure. So while it would be wrong for the starving, it would be wrong in isolation for the starving mother to steal some food from you to feed her baby, I believe the rest of society, if you were to insist upon punishment for this mother, should ostracize you like the asshole you're being, you know, all other things being equal, that you're not also starving type of thing. But anyway, but I don't think it's ever justified to coerce somebody. Said if the state did not coercively enforce laws, too many people would... Okay, well, here we go. Thus, perhaps the state is justified in coercing people and seizing people's property through taxation, because doing so is necessary to prevent a virtual collapse of society. If the state did not coercively enforce laws, too many people would break them. And if the state did not coercively collect tax money, the state could not operate at all. In either of these cases, the state could not provide the crucial social benefits. So, you know, perhaps, yeah, no, the example he gives doesn't talk about coercion, actually, when he is, let me see here. Well, he does, where he starts ordering other passengers to bail out the boat because no one else will bail it out. Again, you know, is that justified in that particular situation? You know, that's going to be something that comes up to everybody, to everybody's individual. I don't think it's a gotcha against libertarianism, because how often does that happen? And if those people still sincerely did not want to do that, and that was the prevailing attitude, that they weren't, that society would punish you for coercing other people. I do not believe it's ever proper to violate someone's body to save your own life. You know, just don't. That there could be limited circumstances where morally you could be justified in a very limited violation of property. But I do think the right to bodily autonomy is pretty sacrosanct. So he here, though, carved out a very narrow exception in which, and I think he's going to go on to say, that it doesn't justify the state writ large, but that it could justify coercion and in some limited circumstances. So he says, if we rely upon cases like this to account for the state's right to coerce or violate the property rights of its citizens, the proper conclusion, and see, I forgot I even read this part. I just came to the same conclusion that he's going to read to, that if you're going to use that for the state, and I don't think you can, I think you can use it for individuals in certain very highly specific situations. But he said, for the state's right to coerce or violate the property rights of its citizens, the proper conclusion is that the state's legitimate powers must be highly specific and content dependent. The state may coerce individuals only in a minimal way necessary to implement a correct or at least well-justified plan from protecting society from the sorts of disasters that allegedly would result from anarchy. The state may not coerce people into cooperating with harmful or useless measures or measures we lack good reason to consider effective. Nor may the state extend the exercise of coercion to pursue just any goal that seems desirable. The state may take the minimal amount of money from its citizens necessary to provide the indispensable goods that justify existence. It may not take a little extra to buy itself something nice. And then he goes on to which things could possibly fall under these categories. He says laws designed to protect citizens' rights, like murder, theft, and laws against murder, theft, and fraud. He's basically arguing for the monarchist state. Policies designed to provide military defense and environmental protection. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Those are the ones I think he's going to conclude can do that. The first list I'm reading is how he divided up all laws. And then he said, yeah, we don't need to get into all those divisions. So he said 1 and 2, the two I just named, could possibly fall into that. And then he says perhaps 7, which is legal tender laws and laws preventing private competition with government. And that, I absolutely disagree, can even remotely fall into those categories. Okay. So, let's see here. But that's not content independent then. Makes it very content dependent, which does not authorize a general political obligation, I think is what he's getting to. It says this is a problem because the state's authority is generally held to be comprehensive and content independent. On a very strict reading of the comprehensive and content independence conditions, the existence of just a few laws that the state is not entitled to make would preclude the states having genuine authority. A more modest version of the comprehensive... I'm recording, Wayne.
I got it.
Okay. Now I'm going to have to edit.
Sorry.
We're not going to edit. We're just going to leave this in. A more modest version of the comprehensiveness and content independence conditions would hold that the state does not have the genuine authority unless at least the majority of the things that it typically does and that it generally considered entitled to do are in fact morally permissible. If the range of coercive actions that the state is actually entitled to take is only a small fraction of what it is generally thought to be entitled to do. Go on, Zena. I can see you want to get down. And of what the state in fact does, there's some dog food on the ground she decided she wanted to eat, then I think the state does not truly have legitimate authority. And I think we must admit that is in fact the case. But I do think he potentially made the case here for the authority of a monarchist state if it doesn't claim to have the authority to do other things. Now, we are today dealing with a state that says it has the authority to do many other things. But I think he kind of dodged the question that, at least in this part of the book, he may have made a justification for a monarchist state. Now, because I hold to a very a strong sense of that you can't coerce people, and if it's their rights they're protecting, they have the right to choose how those rights are protected. You cannot even justify a monarchist state unless everyone consented to it. Now, maybe he will get to that later in the book, but so far he has not, and I want to recognize that fact. He says the state does not, on consequentialist grounds, have supreme authority. Notice the word supreme authority. I think he did, in this chapter at least, provide a justification for some authority. And it's the justification that you will hear from our monarchist brethren. So it's not something surprising. Other agents may use force to achieve the same goals that the state would be justified in using force in the event that the state's own efforts are inadequate. And that's what I was getting to, that these rights actually inure to the individual and not to the state. All right, so his conclusion, which I think I'd agree with. Consequentialist and fairness-based arguments come closest to justifying political authority. Actually, I would take it further than he said. I think those are the ones, they come closest to just, I don't know how I would word that strongly. I would say that they potentially justify political authority for a very narrow range. Now, he's not narrowing it down. He goes, come closest to justifying the broad range of political authority. Nevertheless, they cannot ground content-independent, comprehensive, or supreme authority for the state. I would agree there. The state has a right at most to coercively impose correct and just policies to prevent very serious harms. No one has the right to coercively enforce counterproductive or useless policies, nor to enforce policies aimed at goals of lesser import. The state might be entitled to collect taxes, to administer a system of police and courts to prevent society from individual rights violators, and to provide military defense. In doing so, the state and its agents may take only the minimal funds and employ only the minimal coercion necessary. And I think that also applies to private groups, at least the coercion part. They can collect as much as the market will bear, but the market will tend towards, not, if you have competition, you're going to tend towards the smallest amount. The state may not go on to coercively impose paternalistic or moralistic laws, policies motivated by rent-seeking, or policies aimed at promoting unnecessary goods such as support for the arts or a space program. So we agree there. But I think in some ways, he was really making the Nozikian argument for the minimalist state. And listen, if we got there, I'd be pretty happy. I don't think it's justified, though. But that's much better than we have today. But he's not going there, I don't think, ultimately, because he's not, he's an anarchist, but he's not a deontological anarchist. So I'd like to see how he makes the argument against his own argument for a minimal state. Because I think from a consequentialist argument, he might not have been able to provide justification for a content-independent supreme authority state. But it seems like he was making one without meaning to, for a content-dependent, tiny one. All right, we'll see. The next section is entitled The Psychology of Authority. It's chapter 6. And let's see how many pages this is, the way I do it. Oh, this one seems pretty long. And I see the chapter after that is what if there is no authority. Okay, so it's 100... That's 31 pages. I think the one we just did was about 31 pages. Let's see. I went up to page 100. Sorry, on page 80. No, so the next one's longer. This was only 20 pages. The next one's 30 pages. All right. Bye-bye.